Will you pay the price? The gods sell anything, and to everybody, at a fair price. Emerson. All desire knowledge, but no one is willing to pay the price. Juvenal. There is no royal path which leads to geometry. Euclid. There is no road to success but through a clear, strong purpose. A purpose underlies character, culture, position, attainment of whatever sort. T. T. Munger. Remember, you have not a sinew whose law of strength is not action. You have not a faculty of body, mind, or soul whose law of improvement is not energy. E. B. Hall. We have but what we make, and every good is locked by nature in a granite hand. Sheer labor must unclench. "Oh, if I could thus put a dream on canvas!" exclaimed an enthusiastic young artist, pointing to a most beautiful painting. "Dream on canvas," growled the master. "It is the 10,000 touches with the brush you must learn to put on canvas that make your dream." "There is but one method of attaining excellence," said Sydney Smith, "and that is hard labor." "If only Milton's imagination could have conceived his visions," says Waters, "his consummate industry alone could have carved the immortal lines which enshrine them. If only Newton's mind could reach out to the secrets of nature, even his genius could only do it by the homeliest toil. The works of Bacon are not Midsummer Night's Dreams, but like coral islands they have risen from the depths of truth, and formed their broad surfaces above the ocean by the minutest accretions of persevering labor. The conceptions of Michelangelo would have perished like a night's fantasy, had not his industry given them permanence." Salvini contributes the following to the Century as to his habits of study before he had established himself as a past master of tragedy. "I imposed upon myself a new method of study. While I was busying myself with the part of Saul, I read and reread the Bible, so as to become impregnated with the appropriate sentiments, manners, and local color. When I took up Othello, I pored over the history of the Venetian Republic and that of the Moorish invasion of Spain. I studied the passions of the Moors, their art of war, their religious beliefs, nor did I overlook the romance of Giraldi Cinthio, in order the better to master that sublime character. I did not concern myself about a superficial study of the words, or of some point of scenic effect, or of greater or less accentuation of certain phrases with a view to win passing applause. A vaster horizon opened out before me, an infinite sea on which my bark could navigate in security, without fear of falling in with reefs." His method was not new, but he considered it so, and gives his opinion in quotation marks. He speaks of characters with which his name is not always associated by writers on the stage, but is correct, I think, in the main. "Many years ago, a little boy entered Harrow School and was put in a class beyond his years, wherein all the other boys had the advantage of previous instruction. His master used to reprove his dullness, but all his efforts could not raise him from the lowest place in the class. The boy finally procured the elementary books which the other boys had studied. He devoted the hours of play and many of the hours of sleep to mastering the elementary principles of these books. This boy was soon at the head of his class, and the pride of Harrow. The statue of that boy, Sir William Jones, stands today in St. Paul's Cathedral, for he lived to be the greatest Oriental scholar of Europe. "What is the secret of success in business?" asked a friend of Cornelius Vanderbilt. "Secret? There is no secret about it," replied the Commodore. "All you have to do is to attend to your business and go ahead. If you would adopt Vanderbilt's method, know your business, attend to it, and keep down expenses until your fortune is safe from business perils. Work or starve is nature's motto, and it is written on the stars and the sod alike. Starve mentally, starve morally, starve physically. It is an inexorable law of nature that whatever is not used dies. Nothing for nothing is her maxim. If we are idle and shiftless by choice, we shall be nerveless and powerless by necessity." The mottos of great men often give us glimpses of the secret of their characters and success. "Work, work, work," was the motto of Sir Joshua Reynolds, David Wilkie, and scores of other men who have left their mark upon the world. Voltaire's motto was "Toujours au travail," always at work. Scott's maxim was "Never be doing nothing." Michelangelo was a wonderful worker. He even slept in his clothes, ready to spring to his work as soon as he awoke. He kept a block of marble in his bedroom that he might get up in the night and work when he could not sleep. His favorite device was an old man in a go-cart, with an hourglass upon it, bearing this inscription, "Ancora imparo," "Still I'm learning." Even after he was blind, he would ask to be wheeled into the Belvedere to examine the statues with his hands. Cobden used to say, "I'm working like a horse without a moment to spare." It was said that Handel, the musician, did the work of a dozen men. Nothing ever daunted him. He feared neither ridicule nor defeat. Lord Palmerston worked like a slave, even in his old age. Being asked when he considered a man in his prime, he replied, 79, that being his own age. Humboldt was one of the world's great workers. In summer he arose at 4 in the morning for 30 years. He used to say work was as much of a necessity as eating or sleeping. Sir Walter Scott was a phenomenal worker. He wrote the Waverley novels at the rate of 12 volumes a year. He averaged a volume every 2 months during his whole working life. What an example is this to the young men of today of the possibilities of an earnest life. Edmund Burke was one of the most prodigious workers that ever lived. George Stephenson used to work at mealtime, getting out loads of coal while the miners were at dinner, in order that he might earn a few extra shillings to buy a spelling book and an arithmetic. His associates thought he was very foolish, and asked him what good it would do to learn to read and cipher. He told them he was determined to improve his mind, so he studied whenever he could snatch a minute before the engines fire, and in every possible situation, until he had a good, practical, common-sense education. Garibaldi's father decided that Giuseppe should be a minister, because the boy was so sorry for a cricket which lost its leg. Samuel Morse's father concluded that his son would preach well, because he could not keep his head above water in a dangerous attempt to catch bait in the Mystic River. President Dwight told young Morse he would never make a painter, and hinted that he would never amount to much anyway if he did not study more. Although under the teaching of West and Alston in London, he became a tolerable portrait painter, he did not find his sphere until returning from England on a sailing vessel. He heard Professor Jackson explain an electrical experiment in Paris, when the thought of the telegraph flashed into his mind, and he found no rest until he flashed over the wire the first message, "What hath God wrought?" on the experimental line between Baltimore and Washington. This was May 24, 1844. William H. Vanderbilt was by far the wealthiest man in the world. Chauncey M. Depew estimated his fortune at 200 millions. He left his 8 children 10 millions each, except Cornelius and William K., who had 65 millions each. Commodore Vanderbilt, his father, amassed a fortune of $80 millions in his own lifetime, and that too at a time when it was more difficult to make money than it is now. Mr. C. P. Huntington is a good example of a self-made man. His father was a Connecticut farmer. The farm was left to him, but he traded it off for a lot of clocks which he peddled in mining districts for gold dust and nuggets. He and Mark Hopkins formed a partnership and opened a hardware store in California. They united with Leland Stanford in the construction of a railroad, and they all got rich rapidly. Mr. Huntington is one of the greatest railroad operators of the country. He always acted upon the principle that he would control the stock of any road in which he was interested. He is one of the most methodical men of all the millionaires of this country. He is very plain in his manner, strictly temperate, and very abstemious in his living. He said he never knew what it was to be tired. Russell Sage used to keep a grocery store in Troy, New York. He finally associated himself with Jay Gould, who used to be a constant borrower of money of him. Mr. Sage probably keeps more ready money on hand than any other millionaire. He can nearly always control 10 millions or more at call. He has never speculated in stocks to any extent. Mr. Sage's word is as good as any bond. He has no taste for ordinary diversions except driving. Philip D. Armour, who has the appearance of a prosperous farmer, was born on a farm near Watertown, New Jersey. He became fired with a desire to see the "boundless West." His mind seemed to run to hogs, and with a financial instinct he made up his mind that there was a fortune in transporting the hogs from where they were so plenty to where there were so few of them and so many to eat them. He could now purchase every hog in the world, and then have money left to buy a railroad or two. Mrs. Hetty Green is probably the richest woman in the world. Her fortune has grown from the little industry of her father in New Bedford, Massachusetts. She has raised the 9 millions left her by her father, and 9 millions left her by her aunt, to 30 millions. She is a woman of great ability and courage. She once took with her $5 millions of securities in a satchel on a streetcar to deposit with her banker on Wall Street. The probabilities are that billionaires will be as plentiful in the 20th century as millionaires are today, through hard work, self-denial, rigid economy, method, accuracy, and strict temperance, for not one of the self-made millionaires are intemperate. John D. Rockefeller never tastes intoxicating liquor. He seems as unvarying in his method and system as the laws of the universe. Jay Gould did not use wine or intoxicating liquor of any kind. Mr. Huntington does not even drink coffee, while William Waldorf Astor merely takes a sip of wine for courtesy's sake. Not one of the leading millionaires uses tobacco, and not one of them is profane. Very rich men are almost always honest in their dealings, so far as their word is concerned. William Waldorf Astor, until recently, has been considered the richest man in the world, but John D. Rockefeller surpasses him now, it is said. The whole wealth of Croesus was little more than the income of this modern Croesus for 1 year. Mr. Rockefeller controls about 80 or 90 millions of capital stock in the Standard Oil Trust. The Standard Oil Company is one of the best managed corporations in the world. 2 centuries and a quarter ago, a little tempest-tossed, weather-beaten bark, barely escaped from the jaws of the wild Atlantic, landed upon the bleakest shore of New England. From her deck disembarked 101 careworn exiles. To the casual observer, no event could seem more insignificant. The contemptuous eye of the world scarcely deigned to notice it. Yet the famous vessel that bore Caesar and his fortunes carried but an ignoble freight compared with that of the Mayflower. Though landed by a treacherous pilot upon a barren and inhospitable coast, they sought neither richer fields nor a more congenial climate, but liberty and opportunity. A lady once asked Turner the secret of his great success. "I have no secret, madam, but hard work. This is a secret that many never learn, and they don't succeed because they fail to learn it. Labor is the genius that changes the world from ugliness to beauty, and the great curse to a great blessing." See Balzac in his lonely garret, toiling, toiling, waiting, waiting amid poverty and hunger, but neither hunger, debt, poverty, nor discouragement could induce him to swerve a hair's breadth from his purpose. He could wait even while a world scoffed. "Mankind is more indebted to industry than to ingenuity," says Addison. "The gods set up their favors at a price, and industry is the purchaser." Rome was a mighty nation while industry led her people, but when her great conquests of wealth and slaves placed her citizens above work, that moment her glory began to fade, and vice and corruption, induced by idleness, doomed the proud city to an ignominious history. Even Cicero, Rome's great orator, said, "All artisans are engaged in a disgraceful occupation." And Aristotle said, "The best regulated states will not permit a mechanic to be a citizen, for it is impossible for one who lives the life of a mechanic or hired servant to practice a life of virtue. Some were born to be slaves." But fortunately there came a mightier than Rome, Cicero or Aristotle, whose magnificent life and example forever lifted the false ban from labor and redeemed it from disgrace. He gave dignity to the most menial service, and significance to labor. Christ did not say, "Come unto me, all ye pleasure hunters, ye indolent, and ye lazy," but "Come all ye that labor and are heavy laden." Columbus was a persistent and practical, as well as an intellectual hero. He went from one state to another, urging kings and emperors to undertake the first visiting of a world which his instructed spirit already discerned in the far-off seas. He first tried his own countrymen at Genoa, but found none ready to help him. He then went to Portugal, and submitted his project to John II, who laid it before his council. It was scouted as extravagant and chimerical. Nevertheless, the king endeavored to steal Columbus's idea. A fleet was sent north in the direction indicated by the navigator, but being frustrated by storms and winds, it returned to Lisbon after 4 days' voyaging. Columbus returned to Genoa, and again renewed his propositions to the Republic, but without success. Nothing discouraged him. The finding of the New World was the irrevocable object of his life. He went to Spain, and landed at the town of Palos, in Andalusia. He went, by chance, to a convent of Franciscans, knocked at the door, and asked for a little bread and water. The prior gratefully received the stranger, entertained him, and learned from him the story of his life. He encouraged him in his hopes, and furnished him with an admission to the court of Spain, then at Cordova. King Ferdinand received him graciously, but before coming to a decision, he desired to lay the project before a council of his wisest men at Salamanca. Columbus had to reply, not only to the scientific arguments laid before him, but to citations from the Bible. The Spanish clergy declared that the theory of the Antipodes was hostile to the faith. The earth, they said, was an immense flat disk, and if there was a new earth beyond the ocean, then all men could not be descended from Adam. Columbus was considered a fool. Still bent on his idea, he wrote to the King of England, then to the King of France without effect. At last, in 1492, Columbus was introduced by Louis de Saint Angel to Queen Isabella of Spain. The friends who accompanied him pleaded his cause with so much force and conviction that he at length persuaded the Queen to aid him. Lord Ellenborough was a great worker. He had a very hard time in getting a start at the bar, but was determined never to relax his industry until success came to him. When he was worked down to absolute exhaustion, he had this card which he kept constantly before his eyes, lest he might be tempted to relax his efforts. Quote, "Read or starve." Unquote. Show me a man who has made $50,000, and I will show you in that man an equivalent of energy, attention to detail, trustworthiness, punctuality, professional knowledge, good address, common sense, and other marketable qualities. The farmer respects his savings bank book not unnaturally, for it declares with all the solemnity of a sealed and stamped document that for a certain length of time he rose at 6 o'clock each morning to oversee his labors, that he patiently waited upon seasonable weather, that he understood buying and selling. To the medical man, his fee serves as a medal to indicate that he was brave enough to face smallpox and other infectious diseases, and his self-respect is fostered thereby. The barrister's brief is marked with the price of his legal knowledge, of his eloquence, or of his brave endurance during a period of hope-deferred brieflessness. A rich man asked Howard Burnett to do a little thing for his album. Burnett complied and charged 1,000 francs. "But it took you only 5 minutes," objected the rich man. "Yes, but it took me 30 years to learn how to do it in 5 minutes." "I prepared that sermon," said a young sprig of divinity, "in half an hour, and preached it at once, and thought nothing of it." "In that," said an older minister, "your hearers are at one with you, for they also thought nothing of it." Virgil seems to have accomplished about 4 lines a week, but then they have lasted 1,800 years, and will last 1,800 more. 7 years Virgil is said to have expended in the composition of the Georgics, and they could all be printed in about 7 columns of an ordinary newspaper. Tradition reports that he was in the habit of composing a few lines in the morning, and spending the rest of the day in polishing them. Campbell used to say that if a poet made 1 good line a week, he did very well indeed. But Moore thought that if a poet did his duty, he could get a line done every day. What an army of young men enters the success contest every year as raw recruits. Many of them are country youths flocking to the cities to buy success. Their young ambitions have been excited by some book, or fired by the story of some signal success, and they dream of becoming Astors or Gerards, Stuarts or Wanamakers, Vanderbilts or Goulds, Lincolns or Garfields, until their innate energy impels them to try their own fortune in the magic metropolis. But what are you willing to pay for "success," as you call it, young man? Do you realize what that word means in a great city in the 19th century, where men grow gray at 30 and die of old age at 40? Where the race of life has become so intense that the runners are treading on the heels of those before them, and "woe to him who stops to tie his shoestring." Do you know that only 2 or 3 out of every 100 will ever win permanent success, and only because they have kept everlastingly at it, and that the rest will sooner or later fail, and many die in poverty because they have given up the struggle? There are multitudes of men who never rely wholly upon themselves and achieve independence. They are like summer vines which never grow even ligneous, but stretch out 1,000 little hands to grasp the stronger shrubs, and if they cannot reach them, they lie disheveled in the grass, hoof-trodden and beaten of every storm. It will be found that the first real movement upward will not take place until, in a spirit of resolute self-denial, indolence so natural to almost everyone is mastered. Necessity is, usually, the spur that sets the sluggish energies in motion. Poverty, therefore, is often of inestimable value as an incentive to the best endeavors of which we are capable. End of chapter 6. Recording by David Martin.
Foundation stones. In all matters, before beginning, a diligent preparation should be made. Cicero. How great soever a genius may be, certain it is that he will never shine in his full lustre, nor shed the full influence he is capable of, unless to his own experience he adds that of other men and other ages. By Bolingbroke. It is for want of the little that human means must add to the wonderful capacity for improvement, born in man, that by far the greatest part of the intellect, innate in our race, perishes undeveloped and unknown. By Edward Everett. If any man fancies that there is some easier way of gaining a dollar than by squarely earning it, he has lost his clue to his way through this moral labyrinth, and must henceforth wander as chance may dictate. By Horace Greeley. What we do upon some great occasion will probably depend on what we already are, and what we are will be the result of previous years of self-discipline. By H. P. Liddon. Learn to labor and to wait. By Longfellow. What avails all this sturdiness? asked an oak tree which had grown solitary for 200 years, bitterly handled by frosts and wrestled by winds. Why am I to stand here useless? My roots are anchored in rifts of rocks. No herds can lie down under my shadow. I am far above singing birds, that seldom come to rest among my leaves. I am set as a mark for storms, that bend and tear me. My fruit is serviceable for no appetite. It had been better for me to have been a mushroom, gathered in the morning for some poor man's table, than to be 100-year oak, good for nothing. While it yet spoke, the axe was hewing at its base. It died in sadness, saying as it fell, "Weary ages for nothing have I lived." The axe completed its work. By and by the trunk and root formed the knees of a stately ship, bearing the country's flag around the world. Other parts form keel and ribs of merchantmen, and having defied the mountain storms, they now equally resist the thunder of the waves and murky threat of scowling hurricanes. Other parts are laid into floors, or wrought into wainscoting. or carved for frames of noble pictures, or fashioned into chairs that embosom the weakness of old age. Thus the tree, in dying, comes not to its end, but to its beginning of life. It voyaged the world. It grew to parts of temples and dwellings. It held upon its surface the soft tread of children and tottering steps of patriarchs. It rocked in the cradle. It swayed the limbs of age by the chimney corner, and heard, secure within, the roar of those old unwearied tempests that once surged about its mountain life. All its early struggles and hardships had enabled it to grow tough, and hard and beautiful of grain, alike useful and ornamental. "Sir, you have been to college, I presume?" asked an illiterate but boastful exhorter of a clergyman. "Yes, sir," was the reply. "I am thankful," said the former, "that the Lord opened my mouth without any learning." "A similar event," retorted the clergyman, "happened in Balaam's time. Why not allow the schoolboy to erase from his list of studies all subjects that appeared to him useless? Would he not erase everything which taxed his pleasure and freedom? Would he not obey the call of his blood, rather than the advice of his teacher? Ignorant men who have made money tell him that the study of geography is useless. His tea will come over the sea to him whether he knows where China is or not. What difference does it make whether verbs agree with their subjects or not? Why waste time learning geometry or algebra? Who keeps accounts by these? Learning spoils a man for business, they tell him. They begrudge the time and money spent in education. They want cheap and rapid transit through college for their children. Veneer will answer every practical purpose for them, instead of solid mahogany, or even paint and pine will do. It is said that the editors of the Dictionary of American Biography, who diligently searched the records of living and dead Americans, found 15,142 names worthy of a place in their 6 volumes of Annals of Successful Men, and 5,326, or more than one-third of them, were college-educated men. 1 in 40 of the college-educated attained a success worthy of mention, and but 1 in 10,000 of those not so educated, so that the college-bred man had 250 times the chances for success that the others had. Medical records, it is said, show that but 5% of the practicing physicians of the United States are college graduates, and yet 46% of the physicians who become locally famous enough to be mentioned by those editors come from that small 5% of college-educated persons. Less than 4% of the lawyers were college-bred, yet they furnish more than one-half of all who became successful. Not 1% of the business men of the country were college-educated, yet that small fraction of college-bred men had 17 times the chances of success that their fellow men of business had. In brief, the college-educated lawyer has 50% more chances for success than those not so favored; the college-educated physician 46% more; the author 37% more; the statesman 33%; the clergyman 58%; the educator 61%; the scientist 63%. You should therefore get the best and most complete education that it is possible for you to obtain. Knowledge, then, is one of the secret keys which unlock the hidden mysteries of a successful life. "I do not remember," said Beecher, "a book in all the depths of learning, nor a scrap in literature, nor a work in all the schools of art, from which its author has derived a permanent renown, that is not known to have been long and patiently elaborated." "You are a fool to stick so close to your work all the time," said one of Vanderbilt's young friends. "We're having our fun while we're young. For when will we if we not now? And Cornelius was either earning more money by working overtime, or saving what he had earned, or at home asleep, recruiting for the next day's labor and preparing for a large harvest later. Like all successful men, he made finance a study. When he entered the railroad business it was estimated that his fortune was 35 or $40 million. "The spruce young spark," says Caesar, who thinks chiefly of his mustache and boots and shiny hat, of getting along nicely and easily during the day, and talking about the theatre, the opera, or a fast horse, ridiculing the faithful young fellow who came to learn the business and make a man of himself, because he will not join in wasting his time in dissipation, will see the day. If his useless life is not earlier blasted by vicious indulgences, when he will be glad to accept a situation from his fellow clerk, whom he now ridicules and affects to despise; when the latter shall stand in the firm, dispensing benefits and acquiring fortune. When a man has done his work, says Ruskin, and nothing can anyway be materially altered in his fate, let him forget his toil, and jest with his fate if he will. But what excuse can you find for wilfulness of thought at the very time when every crisis of fortune hangs on decisions? A youth thoughtless, when all the happiness of his home for ever depends on the chances or the passions of the hour. A youth thoughtless, when the career of all his days depends on the opportunity of a moment. A youth thoughtless, when his every action is a foundation stone of future conduct, and every imagination a foundation of life or death. Be thoughtless in any after years, rather than now, though, indeed, there is only one place where a man may be nobly thoughtless, his deathbed. Nothing should ever be left to be done there. "On to Berlin!" was the shout of the French army in July 1870. But, to the astonishment of the world, the French forces were cut in two and rolled as by a tidal wave into Metz and around Sedan. Soon two French armies and the Emperor surrendered, and the German troopers paraded the streets of captured Paris. But as men thought it out, as Professor Wells tells us, they came to see that it was not France that was beaten, but only Louis Napoleon and a lot of nobles, influential only because they bore titles or were favorites. Louis Napoleon, the feeble bearer of a great name, was emperor because of that name and criminal daring. By a series of happy accidents he had gained credit in the Crimean War, and at Magenta and Solferino. But the unmasking time came in the Franco-Prussian War, as it always comes when sham, artificial toy men meet genuine self-made men. And such were the German leaders: William, strong, upright, warlike, every inch a king; von Roon, Minister of War, a master of administrative detail; Bismarck, the mastermind of European politics; and above all, von Moltke, Chief of Staff, who hurled armies by telegraph, as he sat at his cabinet, as easily as master moves chessmen against a stupid opponent. Said Captain Bingham: "You can have no idea of the wonderful machine that the German army is, and how well it is prepared for war. A chart is made out which shows just what must be done in the case of wars with the different nations, and every officer's place in the scheme is laid out beforehand. There is a schedule of trains which will supersede all other schedules the moment war is declared, and this is so arranged that the commander of the army here could telegraph to any officer to take such a train and go to such a place at a moment's notice." When the Franco-Prussian War was declared, von Moltke was awakened at midnight and told of the fact. He said coolly to the official who aroused him, "Go to pigeon hole No. in my safe, and take a paper from it and telegraph as there directed to the different troops of the empire." He then turned over and went to sleep, and awoke at his usual hour in the morning. Everyone else in Berlin was excited about the war, but von Moltke took his morning walk as usual, and a friend who met him said, "General, You seem to be taking it very easy. Aren't you afraid of the situation? I should think you would be busy." "Ah," replied Von Moltke, "all of my work for this time has been done long beforehand, and everything that can be done now has been done." "A rare man this Von Moltke," exclaims Professor Wells, "one who made himself ready for his opportunities beyond all men known to the modern world. Of an impoverished family he rose very slowly and by his own merit. He yielded to no temptation, vice or dishonesty, of course, nor to the greater and ever present temptation to idleness, for he constantly worked to the limit of human endurance. He was ready for every emergency, not by accident, but because he made himself ready by painstaking labor, before the opportunity came. His favorite motto was, 'Help yourself and others will help you.' Hundreds of his age in the Prussian army were of nobler birth, thousands of greater fortune, but he made himself superior to them all by extraordinary fidelity and diligence. The greatest master of strategy the world has ever seen was 66 years at school to himself before he was ready for his task. Though born with the century and an army officer at 19, he was an old man when, in 1866, as Prussian chief of staff, he crushed Austria at Sadowa and drove her out of Germany. 4 years later the silent, modest soldier of 70, ready for the still greater opportunity, smote France, and changed the map of Europe. Glory and the field marshal's baton, after 51 years of hard work. No wonder Louis Napoleon was beaten by such men as he. All Louis Napoleons have been and always will be. Opportunity always finds out frauds. It does not make men, but shows the world what they have made of themselves. Sir Henry Havelock joined the army of India in his 28th year, and waited till he was 62 for the opportunity to show himself fitted to command and skilful to plan. During those 34 years of waiting he was busy preparing himself for that march to Lucknow, which was to make him famous as a soldier. Farragut, the Viking of our western clime, who made his mast a throne, began his naval career as a mere boy and was 64 years old before he had an opportunity to distinguish himself. But when the great test of his life came, the reserve of half a century's preparation made him master of the situation. Alexander Hamilton said, "Men give me credit for genius. All the genius I have lies just in this. When I have a subject in hand I study it profoundly. Day and night it is before me. I explore it in all its bearings. My mind becomes pervaded with it. Then the effort which I make the people are pleased to call the fruit of genius. It is the fruit of labor and thought. The law of labor is equally binding on genius and mediocrity." "Fill up the cask! Fill up the cask!" said old Dr. Bellamy, when asked by a young clergyman for advice about the composition of sermons. "Fill up the cask, and then if you tap it anywhere you will get a good stream. But if you put it but little it will dribble, 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 and you must tap, 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 and then you get but a small stream, after all." The merchant is in a dangerous position, says Dr. W. W. Paton, whose means are in goods trusted out all over the country on long credits, and who in an emergency has no money in the bank upon which to withdraw. A heavy deposit, subject to a side draft, is the only position of strength. And he only is intellectually strong who has made heavy deposits in the banks of memory, and can draw upon his faculties at any time, according to the necessities of the case. They say that more life, if not more labor, was spent on the piles beneath the St. Petersburg church of St. Isaac's to get a foundation, than on all the magnificent marbles and malachite which have since been lodged in it. 50 feet of Bunker Hill Monument is underground, unseen and unappreciated by the thousands who tread about that historic shaft. The rivers of India run underground, unseen, unheard by the millions who tramp about, but are therefore lost? Ask the golden harvest waving above them if it feels the water flowing beneath. The superstructure of a lifetime cannot stand upon a foundation of a day. C. H. Parkhurst says that in manhood as much as in house building the foundation keeps asserting itself all the way from the first floor to the roof. The stones laid in the underpinning may be coarse and inelegant, but even so, each such stone perpetuates itself in silent echo clear up through the pineal. The body is in that respect like an old Stradivarius violin, the ineffable sweetness of whose music is outcome and quotation from the coarse fibre of the case upon which its strings are strung. It is a very pleasant delusion, that what we call the higher qualities and energies of a person maintain that self-centred kind of existence that enables them to discard and contemn all dependence upon what is lower and less refined than themselves. But it is a delusion that always builds in an atmosphere of fact. Climb high as we like, our ladder will still require to rest on the ground. And it is probable that the keenest intellectual intuition and the most delicate throb of passion would, if analysis could be carried so far, be discovered to have its connections with a rather material affair than we know as body. Lincoln took the postmastership for the sake of reading all the papers that came to town. He read everything he could lay his hands on: the Bible, Shakespeare, Pilgrim's Progress, Life of Washington and Life of Franklin, Life of Henry Clay, Aesop's fables. He read them over and over again until he could almost repeat them by heart, but he never read a novel in his life. His education came from the newspapers and from his contact with men and things. After he read a book he would write out an analysis of it. What a grand sight to see this long lank backwoods student lying before the fire in a log cabin without floor or windows, after everybody else was abed, devouring books he had borrowed but could not afford to buy. I have been watching the careers of young men by thousands in this busy city of New York for over 30 years, says Dr. Keeler, and I find that chief difference between the successful and the failures lies in the single element of staying power. Permanent success is oftener won by holding on than by sudden dash, however brilliant. The easily discouraged, who are pushed back by a straw, are all the time dropping to the rear, to perish or to be carried along on the stretcher of charity. They who understand and practice Abraham Lincoln's homely maxim of pegging away have achieved the soldiest success. It is better to deserve success than to merely have it. Few deserve it who do not attain it. There is no failure in this country for those whose personal habits are good, and who follow some honest calling industriously, unselfishly, and purely. If one desires to succeed he must pay the price. Work. No matter how weak a power may be, rational use will make it stronger. No matter how awkward your movements may be, how obtuse your senses, or how crude your thought, or how unregulated your desires, you may by patient discipline acquire, slowly indeed, but with the infallible certainty, grace and freedom of action, clearness and acuteness of perception, strength and precision of thought and moderation of desire. It would go very far to destroy the absurd and pernicious association of genius and idleness, to show that the greatest poets, orators, statesmen, and historians, men of the most imposing and brilliant talents, have actually labored as hard as the makers of dictionaries and arrangers of indexes. And the most obvious reason why they have been superior to other men is that they have taken more pains. Even the great genius, Lord Bacon, left large quantities of material entitled "Sudden Thoughts Set Down for Use." John Foster was an indefatigable worker. He used to hack, split, twist, and pull up by the roots, or practice any other severity on whatever did not please him. Chalmers was asked in London what Foster was doing. "Hard at it," he said, "at the rate of a line a week." When a young lawyer, Daniel Webster, once looked in vain through all the libraries near him, and then ordered at an expense of $50 the necessary books to obtain authorities and precedents in a case in which his client was a poor blacksmith, he won his case, but on account of the poverty of his client only charged $15, thus losing heavily on the books bought, to say nothing of his time. Years after, as he was passing through New York City, he was consulted by Aaron Burr on an important but puzzling case then pending before the Supreme Court. Webster saw in a moment that it was just like the blacksmith's case, an intricate question of title, which he had solved so thoroughly that it was to him simple as a multiplication table. Going back to the time of Charles II, he gave the law and precedents involved with such readiness and accuracy of sequence that Burr asked, in great surprise, "Mr. Webster, have you been consulted before in this case?" "Most certainly not. I never heard of your case till this evening." "Very well," said Burr, "proceed." And when he had finished, Webster received the fee that paid him liberally for all the time and trouble he had spent for his early client. What the age wants is men who have the nerve and the grit to work and wait, whether the world applaud or hiss. It wants a Bancroft who can spend 26 years on the history of the United States, a Noah Webster who can devote 36 years to a dictionary, a Gibbon who can plot for 20 years on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, a Mirabeau who can struggle on for 40 years before he has a chance to show his vast reserve destined to shake an empire, a Farragut, a Van Moult who have the persistence to work and wait for half a century for their first great opportunities, a Garfield burning his lamp 15 minutes later than a rival student in his academy, a Grant fighting on heroic silence when denounced by his brother generals and politicians everywhere, a Field's untiring perseverance, spending years and a fortune laying a cable when all the world called him a fool, a Michael Angelo working 7 long years decorating the Sistine Chapel with his matchless Creation and the Last Judgment, refusing all remuneration therefor, lest his pencil might catch the taint of avarice, a Titian spending 7 years on the Last Supper, a Stevenson working 15 years on a locomotive, a Watt 20 years on a condensing engine, a Lady Franklin working incessantly for 12 long years to rescue her husband from the polar seas, a Thurlow Weed walking 2 miles through the snow with rags tied around his feet for shoes, to borrow the history of the French Revolution, and eagerly devouring it before the sap bush fire, a Milton elaborating Paradise Lost in the world he could not see, and then selling it for £15, a Thackeray struggling on cheerfully after his Vanity Fair was refused by a dozen publishers, a Balzac toiling and waiting in a lonely garret, whom neither poverty, debt, nor hunger could discourage or intimidate, not daunted by privations, not hindered by discouragement. It wants men who can work and wait. That is done soon enough which is done well, soon ripe, soon rotten. He that would enjoy the fruit must not gather the flower. He who is impatient to become his own master is more likely to become his own slave. Better believe yourself a dunce and work away than a genius and be idle. 1 year of trained thinking is worth more than a whole college course of mental absorption of vast series of undigested facts. Facility with which the world swallows up the ordinary college graduate who thought he was going to dazzle mankind should bid you pause and reflect. But just as certainly as man was created not to crawl on all fours in the depths of primeval forests, but to develop his mental and moral faculties, just so certainly he needs education, and only by means of it will he become what he ought to become, man in the highest sense of the word. Ignorance is not simply the negation of knowledge, it is the misdirection of the mind. One step in knowledge, says Bulwer, is one step from sin. One step from sin is one step nearer to heaven. End of chapter 7.